All right, welcome, transurfers and the transurfing curious to another episode of Reality Transplaining with Renee Garcia. Me. It's always weird when I say my name in the third person. I'm like, it makes me kind of feel a little bit odd.
Well,
And Xavier,
remember to everyone else, you're a third person. And Xavier Waterkeyn, hello, millions of people watching.
say hi to ourselves. Hi, Renee Garcia.
Hello, Renee Garcia, third person.
So yes, today on Reality Transplaining, we're going to tackle. This is going to be a two-part series. The first on the induced transition and depression, primarily what to do to get yourself out of that place. Because let's face it, we could talk about induced transitions all day until we're blue in the face, but until we actually talk about actionable steps, you're just resonating at the frequency of the induced transition and probably going deeper into it. And I know a lot of people are struggling with this right now. So we are going to discuss this. And then the second part of our podcast, which will air at a later time, is going to be on debunking what reality transurfing is not. And it's primarily what I would like to talk about is people's obsession with trying to control the mirror image. So that'll be part two. So let's get started, Xavier Waterkeyn. You're the one that...
Renee Garcia. So I'm going to ask you a question, Renee Garcia. Are you ready for the question?
I'm ready for the question. Let me prompt the viewers at home. If you see Xavier Waterkeyn and I throwing some what look like gang signs to each other during the episode, we actually have some secret code that we've come up with to give each other cues of when somebody needs to shut the hell up or talk more. So yep. Don't be confused if we're throwing gang signs at each other. So okay. Let's go. let's kick it off. What do you how should we drop kick this one?
Well, I'm going to ask my question, Renee. Renee, for the purposes of the millions of people that are watching this podcast, would you please define induced transition?
Ooh, I love induced transition because induced transition. What
does it mean? What does it mean?
I know it's kind of a funny one. Induced transition is essentially a downward spiral to some of those lower levels or lower layers of reality where what you don't like and what you don't want to see happen and certain states of being and emotions and circumstances that aren't favorable all begin to exponentially increase as you go into the induced transition. As I like to say, and this is as simple as I can break it down, and this is how I really look at both the induced transition and the wave of success in a way that helps me to really understand both of these concepts, is what I focus on is like it's a seed, right? So if I want to experience the wave of fortune, the wave of success, and I acknowledge that first little win, that plants the seed for the wave of fortune to really, really blossom. And if I can stay focused on that positive information, then I'll see a little bit more positive information or favorable circumstances or something, really, really good. It just starts to kind of exponentially increase. And I slowly, or sometimes rapidly, depending on my dedication, can get myself going in a positive direction. Now, if I'm not attempting to create a positive result in my reality, and I sort of revert back or fall back to my pre-transurfing mindset, and I don't maintain awareness. I see myself, I see my reality, and I get hooked by some pendulum or some bit of bad news, or a family member called me and started an argument or something unfavorable. If I allow myself to get sucked in to that event and I my frequency becomes affected and my thoughts become affected, then the exact same thing happens as the example with the wave of fortune. It just goes in the opposite direction, which is down. So there's no middle, right? There's never any middle. There's never any stagnation. There's never any non-movement. It's either evolution, you're going up to the higher lifelines via the wave of success, or you've been hooked by a pendulum. You are exponentially, seeing more and more of that negative stuff in your layer of reality, and you're spiraling down to those lower levels of reality, which is the induced transition.
Okay, so just to review, the transition part refers to moving from one state of being to another state of being. Normally, you're moving from, when we talk about induced transitions, we're talking about moving from maybe a neutral or positive state of being to a lower negative state of being, correct?
Yes.
Because I can imagine, and this is where you and I might have a little bit of a quibble, but that's okay. I can imagine that there are also transitions that are induced that actually move you to an even higher level and a more positive bent. Because the term induced transition just means that a transition that's been induced. Normally we think of it as going down, but theoretically it can also go up. But since most of people's concerns are when you're plummeting down, we're going to concentrate on that and maybe leave positive induced transitions for another time. Hint, hint.
I like that.
Also, the induced part refers to external reality triggering you into changing your state, correct?
Yep.
So you find yourself, wherever you might be in a circumstance, all of a sudden there is a piece of information, a sensation, some change in the mirror world, and all of a sudden we find ourselves, again, triggered, induced into going into a state that's going to be a lower vibration, more negative. Now, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that these triggers happen because you might have certain, like Pavlov's dogs. You know about the Pavlov's dogs experiments?
Yes.
You ring a bell, they salivate.
Yeah.
Because there's a conditioned reflex that you've never examined.
Mm-hmm.
It could have to do with trauma in your past. It could have to do with a time when you were particularly sensitive to something and a particularly bad event has now flipped you from a state of empowerment to a state of disempowerment. Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that induction could happen for any number of reasons, but we'll look at that. And my question then is, all right, let's assume let's not look too closely as to why these things might happen, but they do happen.
Mm-hmm. Importance levels are another big one,
Yeah.
having attached importance to, an outcome or incoming information, not wanting to see something play out, especially, with the times and everything that's happening socially. So if you're like, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, but it's good to touch on it now. Somebody that, is feeling maybe like they've got a little bit of a handle or a grip on their reality. And then all of a sudden they get news that there's more lockdown, whatever. And then they're like, damn it, I want this to be over with. So all of a sudden you have created an environment where you are allowing an external event to have some sort of
power over you,
influence. Yeah, absolutely. And this is, in my opinion, one of the number one ways that people are getting triggered into induced transitions right now. And again, it's all about importance levels. It really, really, really is.
So people put conditions on their happiness, for example. I won't be happy until the lockdowns stop. All of a sudden, they blame the lockdowns or whatever it is as the focal point for everything is wrong in their world. And then all of a sudden, when yet another piece of information comes through about a lockdown, they're going to go, and they're going to get into the induced transition. Okay, we'll talk about that more later in what we're going to talk about when we're talking about environmentally induced transitions.
Yes.
Walk me through one of your, I suppose Wayne Dyer would have called them erroneous zones, one of those places where you are likely to be triggered by something and historically that you've been induced into, and then tell me what steps you take to get out of it.
So I've noticed for me that I typically tend to get hooked if my self-care levels are pretty low. This hasn't happened in a while because I've really managed my pendulums in this last year, like in a pretty massive way, cutting out toxic family members, moving from a place that was inducing me just by me driving by, some place with an old memory, and I would go into some weird, headspace. So I've been radical in my approach to my pendulum management. And right now, especially since I've moved, it's been really, really good. Like I'm full levels of self-care. I'm well rested. I'm eating extremely well. I'm exercising. So as long as all of that stuff is pretty balanced, even just one bad night's sleep the next day, I'm really, really susceptible to an induced transition. So how that would typically look for me is, let's say I wake up in the morning, I hadn't slept well, but I say, I'm gonna go on with my day. I'm gonna power through. So I don't really pay attention to maybe taking it easy or nursing myself a little bit. I'm like, I'm bad night's sleep's not going to set me back. So then I jump into all my daily things that I do, and I'm making content and I'm engaging with people and I'm writing things and I'm doing all these things. And then maybe halfway through my day, something goes wrong, right? Like I filmed a bunch of content, but I realized my mic wasn't plugged in, or I'm writing something for a number of days and then all of a sudden the file's gone and I can't figure out, something technical, something that is a little bit, some random kind of bad event. And then I go into like some kind of meltdown, and I'm like, God damn it. What, I just filmed 4 videos, and I start with this spiral, and then one more thing comes in, and then it's like an explosion, and then I'll yell at my boyfriend. It sounds so untransurfing of me.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that the first
how embarrassing.
It is. We all know that you're a hypocrite. We all know that your real life is nothing like what you present on TransurfingTV. We all see right through you. That's okay. Let's just keep
wait. Can I tell you something? Just a total random side note, really quick.
Sure,
One time I had a phone session with a therapist that I hadn't spoken with before, and he was going to speak to me over the phone. And I called and the phone picked up, but I think he didn't realize that he had picked the phone up. It was like the phone was live, but he didn't know it. And he started yelling at his wife, and he was like, God damn it, I'm getting ready to get on a phone call. And I thought, oh my God, I'm hearing a therapist yell at his wife because he's getting ready to get on a phone call.
It's great.
So, okay, the cat's out of the bag. I have meltdowns. If you can't notice, my face is like super red right now. I can feel myself flushing. I do have meltdowns. They're not as bad as they used to be, but I definitely do.
Okay. Like I would just say at this point, and to the millions of people watching, right? We are not always 100% on the ball with everything. If we were, we probably wouldn't be incarnated on the planet. We would be working as spiritual guides on a higher plane of reality, whispering in the ears of sensitive psychics. No, tell them this, tell them
Yes.
this. But since we're down here, we're prone to all we're really asking of ourselves, and all we're really asking, maybe you should be asking of yourselves, dear viewers, is that you have a higher batting average. Right?
Yes.
Don't really don't put Renee or me or anybody else explaining ideas or transplaining ideas on a pedestal.
Yes.
We will fall off.
Totally.
From time
oh my
to time.
God. Totally.
We will.
Yes.
We will totally. So I want to go back to something that I think was the main point of what you just said. One of the best ways to deal with an induced transition is prevention is better than cure. So the best way to prevent yourself being vulnerable to being triggered into an induced transition is to maintain healthy self-care. Get enough rest. You are in a human body still. Get enough, work on yourself, work on your internal issues psychologically, because there is a strong psychological component to transurfing, and transurfing is a very powerful tool in the hands of the right drivers, because transurfing is like a car. It will take you from A to B, and it's a very powerful car that can take you from A to B quite quickly and quite unusually, but the car is only as good as the driver. If you've got a really good driver, you'll get really good places. But if you haven't worked on yourself and on your own issues, you're going to transurf your way into really crappy realities very quickly. And that's not a good thing.
Or worse yet, is the people are the people. So we touched on the fact that self-care levels, making sure you're hydrated, you're well rested, all that stuff is handled, right? And you're going into your day a full person. This is the best protection from an induced transition. But then there is also the environmental stuff, like family members that trigger you often, or a spouse, or a job that you hate, or other things that induce you regularly, yet you don't go about either figuring out how to manage that or cutting it off if you can't figure out how to manage it. So what happens, and what I've seen historically with people, and it can be really dangerous because it's kind of maddening. And this is the one part of reality transurfing that if you can't get past it, you're probably going to give up on reality transurfing, because it's just going to be like a roller coaster. And what happens is a person, when they're alone and they're left to their own devices and they're doing their transurfing and their stuff, they're doing good. And then they throw themselves into environments where they probably need to figure a way to cycle out of, but they don't, because they make excuses and they say, oh, this is my job, or this is my blah, 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 or this is my whatever, or I can't cut family members out. And
what? Do you want? I just want to say something here.
Go for it.
Big confession. One of the things that will induce a transition for me is my mother.
Exactly.
Right? My mother has had decades of practice at being herself. Because I have yet to transcend my investment in her being other than she is in this timeline of reality, because I have not transurfed my way into a reality where aspects of herself show up that are different from the ones that I'm historically used to, although I am getting better at it, I will admit. But historically, what's happened is that she will say what she says and the way she says it, and because I had an investment in her being other than she was, it would just throw me.
Yeah.
And I hardly ever raise my voice to anyone else. But she does historically, she does her thing, and it'll set me off.
Yeah.
It'll be like, will you please let me finish my sentence and answer your question before you ask me the next one?
So this
To give you an idea of what the
and it's so common. I mean, it is.
Yes.
Family members, in my opinion, are the biggest trigger for an externally induced transition. It is the biggest. Yes. So here's the thing. When
Yes.
when you aren't willing to take a honest, hard look at that, and you're doing this thing where you're up and down, up and down, up and down, because you can get yourself cool, but then as soon as you encounter mom, you shoot down low. And this is what happened to me. And this is, it sucks and it's sad. And I'm going to admit it. Writing your mother off is a really, really hard thing to do. It is a constant, like, thorn in you. You wrote your mother off. You wrote your mother off. I have guilt from family members come at me. Things like birthdays and Mother's Day and all that crap. It sucks. It totally sucks. But here's the but. It's not as bad as what I was encountering within the relationship. And me getting myself up transurfing, then mom calling and me plummeting to really, really low levels. And I won't get into the details, but last year something went down and I went to an extremely low place. And I woke up in that moment and I thought, you know what? I cannot continue to do this with transurfing and ask people to believe in this stuff if I myself am not able to get off the bus if necessary, right?
Yeah,
if necessary.
There's only so much hypocrisy that you're willing to put up with in yourself.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so you chose, look, whatever it is, whether I'm not good in this particular aspect of transurfing or not, I can't seem to transurf my way into a reality in which my mother is well behaved. Therefore, the best thing that I can do just to manage myself, because the relationship is toxic, right? I have to give myself permission to rid myself of the toxic relationship, since I can't seem, for whatever reason, to cure it right in this space right now. I can't get there from here right now. So as a management strategy, to the millions of people watching, sometimes you just have to give yourself permission to cut ties with whatever is inducing these transitions. Next confession on my part.
Do it.
I cut my mother off. I cut my mother off for 2 years.
Oh wow, you did?
For 2 years, I did not speak to her. I said to myself, I said, Exie, this is getting out of hand. This is getting out of hand. You have put up with way too much. This is the story I'm telling myself. Remember, it's all about the story you tell yourself. You've got way too much. And it got to the point where I was cooking dinner for her, and she was just being such a total biatch that I just said, enough. I can't do this anymore. And I left the dinner half cooked on the stove, and I walked out. I didn't even explain it.
Oh my gosh.
She did not hear from me for 2 years.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
It was only because a whole bunch of things happened in a very short period of time, which I won't go into, that I made contact with her again. Now, she would be back to her old tricks, but not nearly as badly. Because you can teach an old bitch new tricks, but you've got to be firm with the leash.
Yes.
And sometimes the child has to be the parent, because if the parent is acting so childishly, you just have to take charge. Now, continuing the confession. Even now, there are times when I get triggered. However, I have noticed that my mother, in her own screwy way, by being the way that she is, forced me to grow and develop in directions that I might not otherwise have grown and developed in. In her own messed up, screwy, toxic way, she forced me to realize that I had resourcefulness in me, an almost inhuman level of patience, an uncanny ability to find the gold among all the dirt, to find the silver lining in the midst of a cloud cover sky, to be able to find the benefit, no matter how crappy the situation then was. And while I chant the mantra to myself, my world is taking care of me, my world is taking care of me, my world is taking, there is good that will come out of this. I came out of, when I finally managed to deal with a whole bunch of issues that had been building up for a time and solved them, I thought to myself, Xavier, you've pulled off a miracle or two here.
It actually worked out perfectly.
It actually did, well, depending on your definition of perfect. Sometimes the call to sainthood, or even minor sainthood, or even like aspirations to sainthood, does not sound like a choir of angels. But I discovered through this process, and I would invite anybody who is going through a similar issue, that perhaps it might suck and feel horrible right now, but if you can just stay focused on that little point of light at the end of the tunnel, and stay with the light, stay with the light,
Don't turn away from the light.
Don't turn away from the light. The light is there for you, and the light actually gets better. When you're finally out of the tunnel, you are in a much more empowered position, and from that position, you can start frailing, you can start visualizing, embodying a concept of reality in which, in my case, my mother starts behaving better. Now, that potential for my mother to behave better was always there, but it was not going to show up while I was in the state that I was in.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I had to cut off for a while, and then I had to re-examine, remanage, and go through a process.
Yes.
Now I can say, oh, she's calling me for the 12th time today.
Yeah.
But I will maintain a neutral, detached tone of voice. And if she even shows the slightest tendency to be up to her old tricks, I will cut her off and I say, please, do you mind? Because nobody is a singular thing. We're all multiplicities of things, right? I'm sorry that your mother does not seem to be able to show up a facet of herself that isn't toxic for you.
Yeah, it's a little, but it is what it is. This is the bottom line. It is what it is. And this will be the topic of, our next, the part 2 of this podcast, but we'll talk about it here in regards to the induced transition and not a big, huge environmental thing, but maybe just a little thing that
personal one-to-one level.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the thing that I absolutely love about transurfing the most is that it really shows you the absolute power of accountability. And as soon as you can accept that whatever is going on in your life, period, is because you are allowing it. You are allowing it. And if you're continuing to encounter something in your life that is sending you into an induced state, depression, anxiety, some sort of dissociation,
At some level, you are consenting.
absolutely.
It is never
Absolutely.
done without your consent at some level. Now, this is something that nobody wants to hear, but
Oh,
it's a
we
logical.
just had a big issue in the Facebook group about it because somebody said something that was,
Okay, can
yeah.
we go through that, because that's again one of these interpersonal small induced transitions that can blow up and turn into a vortex pendulum that just sucks people in if they allow themselves to get into that state. Please explain that one for us.
Well, it was a doozy, and there was
Okay.
actually a moderator that was removed
Oh,
from the group. I mean, he's still in the group, but he was removed as a moderator. And I had a number of people message me that were very upset. Another one of them being a moderator, and two people actually left the group and messaged me that they were leaving the group. So who knows how many people
okay.
left the group that didn't message me. But what the issue was is somebody asked, from a transurfing perspective, how do you deal with sexual harassment in the workplace?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you see this post?
No, I didn't. I tend to stay away from the posts because sometimes they can, for me, they can be an invitation for rescuing. Sometimes people will say
Yes.
something and I'll make a comment
Yes.
back, but I have to resist the temptation to come in and try to solve everything for everybody. Fine, if you want to rent my problem solving services at $175 an hour, you're perfectly welcome to.
Yes.
But I'm too busy in my life solving issues in exchange and exchanging that energy for money than to be volunteering too much of myself. I will
When
maybe
you
say,
and sometimes you don't
correct.
even know what the intention is of the other person. So it's
Exactly.
like,
I might say a brief sentence, and then people are free to interpret that sentence any way that they like.
yes.
But I will step back from being overly involved in something because it's not. I basically say to myself, that's not my pendulum.
Yeah. It's not my
It,
pendulum. Exactly.
Actually,
I,
that's a great thing to put on a T-shirt.
oh,
That's not
yes.
my pendulum.
I'm writing that
Write
one
that
down.
one down, Renee. You can put that
So
into the moon.
So I'm usually the same. I will add a little, I will kick in my little 2 cents and I'm good to go and I leave the thing and whatever. But this one spiraled out of control, and somebody in there said,
What was the response that created all the controversy?
well, the seed that created the controversy was the victim blaming stuff, right?
Okay.
Well, if you're experiencing that, then it's because you're allowing that into your layer of reality, which is where my philosophy of reality transurfing and Vadim Zeland's philosophy of reality transurfing, our perspectives differ a little bit. I do
Okay.
not believe that every single event is caused by you. I think that that is a product of some megalomania. You know, you're the center of the universe and you're in ultimate control. I really do believe that we are dropped into a sea of cause and effect, and sometimes some goofy shit's gonna happen.
Yeah.
Now you didn't necessarily cause the goofy thing to happen, right? But if you if you buy it and you stay with it long term, then it is on you, right? Then you do have accountability. But things go ahead.
Well, it's, for example, this place where you differ, and I think people struggle with this a lot, because they say, how can you say that? Does that mean that if a child gets raped, that it's their fault?
That's exactly where the conversation went. That's exactly where the conversation went.
And I'm sure that that's the sort of thing. To which my response is this. I remember being a child, being born into this sea of cause and effect. We're on a particular plane of reality, right? We are consciousness embodied or focused in a physical body on this plane of reality in order to experience certain things that cannot otherwise be experienced, right? First step. Second step, we all understand that when we enter, we are entering as vulnerable beings, right? Because that's part of the journey. We have vulnerabilities. We are, like I said in a couple of episodes ago, whatever, we are all born premature. We are all born vulnerable. That does not give somebody else the right to exploit that vulnerability.
Exactly.
The vulnerability is a state of being. What we as evolved beings will do is we will understand that vulnerability. We will understand that temporary immaturity. The child is a temporarily immature and vulnerable version of the adult that child will one day become. We all know this because we have all experienced that vulnerability and that immaturity in ourselves when we were children.
Absolutely.
Just because somebody is vulnerable does not give carte blanche, write a blank check to exploit that vulnerability.
So,
a child is not asking to be abused. A child is simply vulnerable to abuse. It's the difference between responsibility and blame. It sounds odd, but when we're children, we are still responsible for what we are responsible for. Even as adults, we are responsible for what we are responsible for. If I am molested, it is because I am vulnerable somewhere. And the lesson here is I must build my consciousness to a level where I will be vibrating at a level where I will not, or maturing or growing into a level where that simply won't happen to me.
Advantage, right? This is a good place to talk about when. Okay, so the issue on Facebook that happened, and the girl said the thing, right? And she's obviously an adult in a workplace environment. I believe she's in the Middle East, so you know some of the social issues there are a little bit different here, and some of the things that happen are a little bit more extreme, but different social circumstances.
But that's her soul journey, and that's something else we'll discuss in a future one. But that's her soul journey. She is there in that environment, confronted by a particular invitation to participate in what, from our perspective, might be a really screwy reality.
Yes, absolutely. So here is where you can sort of, I don't want to say merge the two realities, one from that of a child and then the adult, but it kind of is like that, right? So the child, and the person that said this was ultimately the person that left the group. I can't believe you guys, because somebody said, well, you know, sounds like some victim blaming. What about you know, when sexual abuse happens to a child? And then somebody said, well, it doesn't matter, everybody's responsible for their own reality. And people were like, well, fuck this, I'm out of here, right? Rightfully so. I was offended.
And I don't blame them, because it implies that the consciousness of our consciousness when we are children is the same as our consciousness when we are adults.
Exactly. So,
or even when our consciousness when we're feeling okay about ourselves and we're integrated is the same as our consciousness when we're in a transition and we're crazy. It's implying that the consciousness of a sane person is the same as the consciousness of that person when they're suffering from a mental illness. They're different states of being.
They're different states of being.
Rules.
Exactly.
Different rules apply. And yes, it is all about responsibility, but it's like asking somebody who's drowning and who has been struggling in the water for days and is about to dive up and just saying, well, you're responsible for your reality. You should just pick yourself up out of the water right now, even though you're sunburned, dehydrated, and exhausted, because we're going to treat you just like somebody who's just fallen into the water. That is insane.
It is. And that's what can give bodies of knowledge like Reality Transurfing a really, really bad reputation if it's not clarified. And the state of being and the different circumstances and all that stuff is a very, very good way to describe the sort of social phenomenon that's going on here. So getting back to the subject at hand, the induced transition of the adult and accountability. So
yes,
I am not a child, right? I was once a vulnerable child who was subject to certain abuse. Looking back on it, did I create that? Absolutely not. I didn't do it. And this is maybe why I believe that this should not, this is an exception. This is absolutely an exception. However, for me now, as an adult, evolved out of that state of being of a vulnerable child, this is my advantage now. I am no longer a vulnerable child. If something is happening in my reality that I do not like, no matter how silly or how serious, I have the power to take control and eliminate that situation from my life if I want to do it, right? If I want to do it.
An overly simplified interpretation of you create your reality is exactly what we've been describing. It's an overly simplified interpretation. I personally, at the risk of going right at the edge here, would say that I agree with you. The child being molested the child is not creating that reality, but we don't create our realities anyway. We do not write the scripts. When people say you create your reality, that's simplistic. The more sophisticated point of view is, no, you create your experience of reality.
You choose.
That's quite different. Yep, you create circumstances in which, and every circumstance that you create through your state of consciousness and your state of being, as it is in that moment, is an invitation, right? It is an invitation because you're not the only person in the universe. We are all aspects of different, if you like, at the ultimate level, we're all aspects of God pretending to be different things. All right. But while we are pretending to do different things, we are individualized points of consciousness. As individualized points of consciousness, we choose to enter a reality in which you, Renee, are different from me, Xavier, which is different from all the millions of people watching this, right? Each one of us is an individuated point of consciousness, and we are where we are at. Now, my vulnerability as a child will invite caring, nurturing, a desire to help and assist and to grow to a being whose consciousness is in a state of evolution where they will take that vulnerability and they will nurture it. And they will say, little child,
I empathize with you because I was once where you were. And I can see the great potential for growth in you. I can see the great flowering of the being that you will become. I can see from you, little acorn, the great tree that will grow. And I, being who I am and standing for what I am, will do what I can to contribute some small amount of rain and sunlight to make you grow, so that you can fulfill your potential. Now, if I am another consciousness that's so screwed up that it looks at innocence and wants to destroy it and exploit it, unfortunately, that child is going to be vulnerable to that, right? It's our responsibility to decide how we respond to the other consciousnesses that come our way. For example, it's not just about physical children, it's also our inner child. We talk about the inner child often in psychology, right? The person that you were when you were 5 years old or 3 years old, right, still lives within us. Little Exie still exists in the decades older version of him and will always exist, because that which exists will always exist. Nevertheless, and if I experienced, and name me one, I challenge any one of the millions of people watching this. I challenge all of you. Is there one of you that had a childhood that was entirely free of trauma or abuse from an unconscious adult?
Good point.
Right? I have experienced abuse, psychological abuse, emotional abuse from adults who were in position of power who should have known better, but they didn't. And for whatever reason, I was in a position of vulnerability, and okay, trauma happened. But like you, I'm an adult now. Like you, and like anybody else who was once a child and looking back into the past, I can reframe that and say, okay, that sucked. It was horrible. It should not have happened, but it was there. It is part of my experience. Do I want to continue that being my experience? And this is true of any induced transition, because that's what a trigger is. It's just an induced transition. It's true of any induced transition.
The thing that's coming up as I'm hearing you say this is a couple of months ago, I did a video on learned helplessness. And this is really sort of where the rubber meets the road, right? When we are children going through things that we don't have any control over, and, you know, we're exploited or we're abused or we're in an environment that's not healthy, all that kind of stuff.
Mistreated, neglected.
The way that we deal with that is, since we are helpless, right, we convince ourselves as a coping mechanism of our helplessness. So when we convince ourselves of our helplessness, this is a strategy of protection, and it's a strategy of reconciliation, trying to make sense of what's going on, right? Well, I'm helpless. The problem is that most people that are adults today that don't have their shit together, right? Still in toxic environments where a bunch of chaos and stuff isn't, is just swirling all the time. Maybe a person isn't able to care for themselves financially, basic dysfunction, drug and alcohol, all that kind of stuff. That stems from that state of learned helplessness, that the person doesn't feel the ability, or worse, uses their helplessness as an excuse to not go about managing their reality, their pendulums, their addictions, and all of that stuff. And to a small extent, to a big extent, what it boils down to is calling yourself out in the areas of your life where you're saying to yourself, oh, well, this just is the way that it is because this is the way that it is. And I've got to accept this and all that kind of stuff. And again, getting back to what we were, where we said something about midway through this conversation, this is you accepting the invitation, and this is you allowing this as an adult into your layer of reality and being
in the present.
complicit. What?
Yeah, yes, and it happens in the present. It doesn't happen in the past because the point of power is always in the present. So if I continue to allow that childhood trauma to control me, I'm consenting to that. What you're talking about with learned helplessness is also learned victimhood. Because
totally.
you begin to play the victim role, and then you begin to maybe fall in love with the victim role, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And I know this is so hard for so many people to hear, especially in the midst of something horrible. But if you can just take a little moment out of every day and detach from the process and say, ultimately, the buck has to stop somewhere. And the buck will always stop here and now, wherever here happens to be and whenever now happens to happen, it will happen. At some point, in order for you to progress, you will have to say, no, I do not consent to continue being the victim in this scenario. I am in a different place now.
Yep.
And even if the mirror world surrounding you does not immediately reflect that, the first point must always be a decision. No, the buck stops here.
Yes.
Once you've made the decision that the buck has stopped there, then that is the beginning of being able to transurf your way into a new reality. But it won't happen while you are still locked up in the drama. It's a bit like, and here I'm going to go out on a limb again, the Holocaust, right? Used to be friends with a Jewish family, and the Holocaust was constantly coming up, blah, 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 blah. I never got to say to this, but I wish I had an opportunity to say this. I always said, yes, I understand the Holocaust was horrible. All of us actually have Holocausts in our own ancestry, if we look back enough. Half of my ancestors, well, not half, maybe a quarter of my ancestors, right? The Spaniards who took over South America, one group of those ancestors slaughtered the other group of ancestors, right? It just happened, right? The fact that any Paraguayan Indians survived long enough to produce a genetic line that ultimately led through one thread to me is miraculous. Considering everything but my other genetic line with the Spaniards coming from Europe and the Portuguese, blah, 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 because in my genetics, I've got about 8 different ancestries happening. And they're all from everywhere. It's like a whole bunch of different things coalesce this thing that ends up looking Jewish. Who knew? Anyway, the point I'm making is that we all of us have Holocausts in our past. But every time that we go, oh, the Holocaust, oh, grieving for the ancestors that we lost.
Yes.
The Nazis win all over again.
Oh yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. And it's not only like that, it's with all the things, like people that go to AA and they sit there and reminisce about how shitty of a human being they used to be when they drank or did drugs. It's the same thing. It's like you're going.
Every time they go there, the alcohol wins again. You go to Narconon. Every time they go on about how awful they were when they were addicted and they stole from their parents and they did horrible things and they broke into well, the heroin won again. You can't. Or every time I go back to that past when that teacher felt me up the wrong way and I thought, uh-oh.
Teacher won again.
What?
Teacher won
It's
again.
and every time I condemn that and go into that, he wins.
Yeah.
Right?
It's about managing.
Yeah, I've got a really close friend who is managing his own sexual abuse story in his own way. And okay, he'll do what he needs to do. But if every time he goes into that space about how horrible it was, that person who was in a position of power and exploited him wins again.
Totally. So this is a perfect place for us to leave off here and then prep everyone for what the next part of this podcast is going to be. And that is actually like taking the current circumstances and instead of attempting to work in this downward and back sort of thinking and try to make sense of the circumstances, how shitty they are within the shitty circumstances themselves, and resonating at that level and continuing to induce how you can take transurfing and actually move yourself out of that space, even though that space may still exist, you can exist alongside of it in a different way, in a better way, and actually transurf yourself to a better reality regardless of the circumstances. So part 2, take a peek at that when it drops. And this was a good one, Xavier. Thank you for joining me on it. And I look forward to the next conversation. I hope you guys will join us on part 2. Bye.
Bye.